about all kinds of stuff. Professor Dave explains.
Continuing with our study of the Israelites, in the biblical book of Samuel, the idea that the Israelites should have a king is not God's doing. Rather, it is the people themselves who ask the prophet Samuel to appoint them one so they might be like all the other nations. But before he agrees, he describes for them the tyranny and injustice that they will suffer from being subjected to a powerful ruler, and in particular, the forced labor that will be demanded of them. And since this book was written long after the monarchy had become a reality, it had the examples of actual Israelite kings to draw upon, beginning with David's son Solomon, who forced his subjects to perform the labor required to build both the temple in Jerusalem and his own palace. But generally speaking, the biblical narratives that describe the era of Israelite monarchy are very positive about the institution of kingship. For the Bible, the ideal ruler was David, who was the second king. Though the first one, Saul, was thought to have been initially approved by God, he was an ordinary person whom Samuel found by casting lots. He proved to be unstable and not dedicated enough to his responsibilities. So after he was killed in battle by the Philistines, his family, which would otherwise have continued after him as a dynasty, was replaced with the line of David late in the 11th century BCE. It was David who conquered the city of Jerusalem, which had been a Canaanite town, and made it his capital with the idea that because it was in the center of the country, it would be equally accessible to all of the tribes. He also had the idea of building the temple as a national place of worship. According to the Book of Kings, God did not allow him to build it himself because of the violent life he had led as a warrior, which suggests that the writer needed to explain why the nation's greatest king was not responsible for its most important institution. But there is some disagreement among historians of the period as to whether David was even a real person, or simply the mythical founder of a dynasty that was recording its history after several centuries had gone by, and the earliest archaeological evidence is for the House of David rather than for David himself. The Book of Kings tells us that under David and Solomon, the kingdom of Israel reached from the Mediterranean Sea to Arabia, and from the Red Sea in the south to the Euphrates in the north, while the neighboring kingdoms such as Edom, Moab, and Ammon became vassals of the Israelites. But the kingdom split in two after the death of Solomon, when a man named Jeroboam, who had opposed Solomon's dictatorial behavior and that of his son Rehoboam, founded his own dynasty in the north of the country. This northern kingdom, called Israel, contained the territories of 10 of the 12 tribes, and it existed alongside the southern kingdom of Judah until it was destroyed by the Neo-Assyrian Empire at the end of the 8th century BCE. There is, however, a theory that there never was a single unified kingdom of Israel. Two separate smaller states developed, in the north and in the south, but in the centuries that followed, writers in Judah, which was ruled by the Davidic dynasty, came to see David as not only the first legitimate king, since Saul had lost God's support, but as the king of the entire nation, which was ruled from his capital of Jerusalem. On the other hand, the archaeological discoveries of recent years might indicate that already in the 10th century, large Israelite fortifications were being constructed for the first time in Jerusalem and elsewhere, which suggests that a united kingdom did exist at that time. While Judah was ruled for the 300 years of its existence by the family of David, Israel had a series of dynasties which overthrew their predecessors and ruled in their place. Since the writers of the biblical narrative were from Judah, they favored the Davidic dynasty and considered the northern kings illegitimate. They also criticized them for establishing their own cult centers in the cities of Dan and Bethel as an alternative to the one in Jerusalem, and for sanctioning the worship of foreign gods, such as the ones that King Ahab's wife Jezebel brought with her from her native Phoenicia. Ahab was the son of Omri, who had made himself king in a coup during the early 9th century BCE, and his relatives continued to rule in the Israelite capital of Samaria for several more decades. They were followed by the dynasty of Jehu, which ruled from the middle of the 9th century to the middle of the 8th. According to the Book of Kings, the two kingdoms were at war from the time of their initial break, though we have no evidence of where, when, or how often they fought. We do know that the third Israelite king, named Baasha, came close to besieging the Judean capital of Jerusalem in the early 9th century. He was in the process of building a fortress just outside the city, which would have cut it off from the rest of the region, when its king, Asa, paid a large bribe to Aram, a Syrian kingdom centered around the city of Damascus to the north, to break its treaty with Israel and attack it instead. Baasha abandoned his fortress, and Asa used its materials to build up his own defenses. The two kingdoms improved their diplomatic ties later in the 9th century when Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, arranged a marriage between his son Jehoram, who would succeed him as king, and Athaliah, who was the daughter of Ahab. Jehoshaphat also joined Ahab around the year 860 BCE in a battle to recover from Aram the town of Ramoth Gilead across the Jordan River, which had once been part of the territory of Israel, but the attack was a failure and Ahab was killed. Jehoshaphat then launched with Ahab's son a war against the kingdom of Moab. Two of the successors of these kings, Ahaziah and Joram, also began a joint campaign against Aram around 840 BCE. A century later, in 732, the Israelite Pekah formed an alliance with the Aramean king Rezin to attack Judah. So the Judean king Ahaz turned to the Assyrian Tiglath-Pileser III for help. The Assyrian Empire was then at the height of its military power, and Tiglath-Pileser responded to the request of Ahaz by defeating Rezin, who was his vassal, and should therefore not have acted without his permission, and absorbing his territory. Tiglath-Pileser then turned to Israel itself, annexing territory from several tribes, including all of the tribe of Naphtali, and deporting many of their inhabitants to Syria. In 720 BCE, the Assyrian conquest was renewed under Tiglath-Pileser's son, Shalmaneser, who besieged Samaria for 3 years, but it was finally conquered by his successor, Sargon II, who, according to an inscription recorded on the walls of his palace, deported 27,000 of its people. His son Sennacherib then destroyed it entirely. In 701 BCE, Sennacherib turned to Judah after it participated in the rebellion of a number of Assyrian vassal states in Canaan and Phoenicia. He laid siege to Jerusalem, but broke off his attack after its king Hezekiah paid him a ransom, giving him all of the temple's silver utensils and stripping the gold plating from its doors. Though the Bible records this fact, it attributes Sennacherib's decision to withdraw to divine intervention. Hezekiah then renewed his subjection to the Assyrian king, and his son Manasseh, who ruled for the first half of the 7th century. He remained loyal to Sennacherib's successors and assisted them in their building projects and military campaigns. Judah's circumstances changed after the Assyrian Empire was brought to an end in the late 7th century by a coalition of people, including the Medes and the Babylonians. In 609, the Egyptian king Necho sent an army to help defend his Assyrian allies from their new enemies, and the current Judean king Josiah, who seems to have been allied with the Babylonians, was killed when he tried and failed to stop Necho at the northern town of Megiddo. Necho then placed Josiah's son Jehoiakim on the throne of Judah as his vassal. This arrangement lasted for a few years until Babylonia defeated Egypt, at which point Jehoiakim switched sides, but in 601 he joined several other states in the area in a rebellion against Babylonian authority. This led the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar to launch a full-scale invasion of Judah that ended in 597, when he pillaged Jerusalem's wealth and deported its ruling classes. He appointed Jehoiakim's brother Zedekiah as king, but when Zedekiah decided to stop paying the tribute expected of him and to ally himself with Egypt, Nebuchadnezzar returned in 586 and completely destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. The remaining population was deported to Babylonia, which became the first sizable community of the diaspora, the Jewish world outside of the land of Israel. Like other ancient Near Eastern monarchies, the Israelite royal court was the center of administration, and as in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Hittite Empire, it was the king's family and personal friends who carried out the duties of running a country. But there is nothing to suggest that the kings of Jerusalem and Samaria were anywhere near as powerful as their counterparts in Egypt, or that they had as tight a control over the affairs of their subjects, though the writers of the Bible certainly believed that they were the only thing keeping the 12 tribes from going to war with one another. They also were not made into practically divine entities as the pharaohs were, and they did not approach their God directly, but through priests and prophets. Though we do not have actual documents from the Israelite courts of the sort found written on clay tablets in Mesopotamian cities, one of the latest books of the Bible, Chronicles, was written by people who may have had access to the administrative records of the House of David, and to earlier historical works that have not survived. Chronicles lists many of the offices of the court and the temple, and the names of the people who filled them in the time of David. Although the Canaanite cities of the second millennium BCE had used cuneiform for their correspondence and documents, the Israelites of the first wrote things down on parchment scrolls using the 22-letter alphabet of the Phoenicians and other Semitic peoples. This explains why their documents, though more recent, have not survived. Trade with the rest of the Mediterranean world expanded under the monarchy, and the Bible specifically associates this process with Solomon, whose temple was built with cedar wood brought from Lebanon on Israelite ships. Solomon also imported materials for his palace, and he traded with a place called Ophir for gold, with Egypt for horses, and with Asia Minor for chariots. Sea trade at that time was conducted through the port of Jaffa, next to the modern city of Tel Aviv. There were also two major land routes used in that region, the King's Road, which went northeast from Egypt to Mesopotamia, and the Coastal Road, or Via Maris, which ran from south to north. Both of these roads went through Syria, which explains its strategic importance for the Egyptians, the Hittites, and the Assyrians. Our written sources for this period, which are drawn primarily from the Bible, resemble other historical narratives from the ancient Near East in that they are primarily interested in kings, battles, and gods. But they also differ from them in the sense that they are not accounts written in the first person in which a king boasts about his accomplishments in war, his building projects, or his devotion to his god. They are instead third-person narratives that describe the actions of each king and explain their successes and failures, and even their illnesses, in terms of their devotion to God and their opposition to foreign cults. This makes them a bit closer to the sort of history writing we find later in Greece, in the sense that they look for the causes behind events and are not afraid to be critical. Even the kings of Judah, where these books were written, are sometimes blamed for not doing enough to rid the land of foreign worship, which the Book of Kings so dislikes that it praises the 8th century king Hezekiah for melting down a copper sculpture of a serpent that was believed to have been made by Moses himself, because people had taken to burning incense in front of it. Hezekiah is associated, in both the Bible and the archaeological record, with a sustained effort to stop the worship of gods other than Yahweh, and to destroy the high places across the country where people were bringing their offerings. One such shrine has been found that was walled off after a stone latrine was placed inside to make it unclean for worship. Then, in the 7th century BCE, King Josiah was the driving force behind a further religious reform that included the composition of the Book of Deuteronomy, now thought to have been original to this era because it shares the same attitudes about the centrality of the temple and the evils of foreign worship as the historical narratives that were also being written around this time. And it associates any misfortunes that might befall the people with their failure to keep their covenant with God. It also contains a number of laws about agriculture, kings, and military service that are not found elsewhere in the Pentateuch. Beginning with David, the king had a high priest who acted as his personal advisor and interpreted God's intentions for him. He might, for example, be consulted about the likely outcome of a battle. The priest was in charge of the other priests and Levites who ran the temple, which was a place of animal sacrifice, agricultural offerings, music, incense, and prayer. The activities of the temple and its physical upkeep were financed by a tax of half a shekel, about a fifth of a gram of silver, that adult Israelites were expected to pay whenever a census of the people was taken. The priests were also responsible for teaching the people about the laws they had to follow. Because ancient Israel was a primarily agricultural society, many of its rules revolved around the proper use of the land and its produce. Portions of each crop and percentages of animals were given to feed the priests and Levites, and the poor who did not own their own land or had lost it to debt were allowed to take some of the produce of others. There was also a blanket forgiveness of debts during every 7th year, when the land was allowed to rest, and Israelites who had sold themselves as slaves to their creditors would be freed after 7 years of service. Any land that indebted farmers had been forced to sell would also be returned to them or their families during the Jubilee that happened every 50 years. On the other hand, slaves who were bought from other countries could be kept indefinitely. And while some of the Bible's laws, for example the prohibition of charging interest on loans, were intended to protect only Israelites, others explicitly applied to both the Ezrak, or citizen, and the Goy, or alien. The biblical stories of this period describe a society in which status distinctions were taken for granted. Friends of the king wielded power that others did not have, and the priests and nobles of Jerusalem could expect to enjoy a comfortable life despite the suffering of others, for which they are criticized by several of the biblical prophets. Women did not normally participate in Israelite public life to the same degree as men, though they could own and inherit property. But once they were married, they became part of their husband's family, and their property went to him. And since, like the men, they belonged to specific tribes, if they did inherit their family's land, they then had to marry within their own tribe to keep it from going to their husbands. A few women, like the prophetess Deborah, are singled out in the Bible for their leadership of the nation, though this had more to do with their personal charisma than with any publicly sanctioned authority. The prophets, in general, were something of an anomaly so far as the country's social structure was concerned. There were official prophets appointed by kings to advise them about God's will, as Nathan did for King David. But because men of God were ultimately self-appointed, in the sense that they claimed their authority came directly from God, prophets might become gadflies of the establishment, speaking truth to power. Elijah took it upon himself to berate the Israelite king Ahab for his idolatrous ways, while Jeremiah, who lived in Judah in the late 7th century, prophesied the country's destruction at the hands of the Babylonians, who had become a military threat as punishment for its sins. He was so disliked by the aristocracy of Jerusalem that at one point he was thrown into a pit. Even Nathan, who was David's friend and advisor, felt free to criticize him for arranging to have Bathsheba's husband killed so that he could have her for himself. The proof that a prophet had been chosen by God was their ability to express his will convincingly, and sometimes the power to work miracles. Elijah famously demonstrated this in a showdown with the priests of the Canaanite god Baal, whom he defeated by allegedly lighting an altar on fire through prayer alone, which they were unable to do. He also had a cloak reportedly infused with God's power, which he gave to his assistant Elisha when he became a prophet so that he could work miracles as well. While the Babylonian exile marked the end of the Israelite state and of the institutions most closely associated with it, the king, the temple, and the land itself, it was also the beginning of a new identity, a new culture, and a different set of ideas, which came to be known not as Hebrew or Israelite, but as Jewish. In the centuries that followed, this Jewish community, both in the land of Israel and outside it, would play an important part in the religious, social, and political life of the ancient world.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe to my channel for more tutorials. Support me on Patreon so I can keep making content. And as always, feel free to email me, ProfessorDaveExplains@gmail.com.